April 1943. Aboukir, Egypt. Number 103 Maintenance Unit. The Spitfire sat low on its trestles, cowlings peeled back like ribs on a carcass. Sand had worked into every seam. The intake housing was dented. The filter casing cracked along its weld line. Dust clung to the oil streaks beneath the exhaust stubs. Section leader Fitter James Harlow crouched beside the port wing root, one hand on the battered Vokes filter, the other holding a crumpled work card. The aircraft had logged 240 operational hours, 12 sorties in 3 weeks, 2 emergency landings on rough strips, 1 engine change, no spare filters in the depot. He glanced across the tarmac. Wing Commander I.R. Gleed's personal mount, a B-502 IRG, a low-level fighter that needed to be fast, tight and responsive at treetop height. The engineering officer had scrawled a note across the repair sheet. Await factory replacement parts. No field modifications authorized. Harlow folded the card and slipped it into his breast pocket. Then he reached for a roll of sheet metal and a tin of filler paste. James Harlow was 32 years old, a fitter by trade, 12 years in the RAF before the war, most of it on ground crew postings across Malta, Iraq and Egypt. He knew Merlins the way a surgeon knows anatomy, timing chains, magnetos, carburetor floats, the small adjustments that separated a reliable engine from a temperamental one. He ran a section of 8 men at number, 103 maintenance unit, 2 engine fitters, 3 riggers, a tinsmith, an armourer, a stores clerk who could conjure parts from thin air or admit defeat with equal honesty. They worked under canvas when the wind was calm and in the open when it was not. Their workshop was a patch of hardpan beside the taxiway, marked by a row of fuel drums and a rack of salvaged cowling panels leaning against wooden crates. Aboukir sat 25 miles east of Alexandria, near the coastal town of Aboukir. The airfield had been a grass strip before the war. Now it was compacted sand, pierced by taxi tracks and revetments. The maintenance unit occupied the southern edge of the field, a sprawl of tents, tool sheds, and open-air work bays where damaged Spitfires arrived by rail or airlift for rebuild. The desert did not forgive machinery. Dust found its way into everything: oil seals, control rods, gun breeches. The Vokes tropical air filter, a bulbous casing bolted beneath the Merlin's nose, kept the worst of the sand out of the supercharger, but it choked airflow, robbed power, added drag. Pilots hated it. The alternative was a seized engine after 20 hours. Wing Commander Ian Richard Gleed commanded number 244 Wing, a fighter unit tasked with low-level sweeps over the coastal zone and interdiction runs against Axis supply columns. He flew a clipped-wing Spitfire LF Mark 5B, modified for agility below 10,000 feet. His personal aircraft was AB-502, coded IRG. It had been with him since Tunisia. He trusted it. He flew it hard. Gleed was not a man who complained. But Harlow could read a pilot's body language after a sortie. The way he pulled off his helmet. The way he lingered beside the cowling after shutdown, one hand resting on the warm metal. Gleed wanted speed. He wanted roll rate. He wanted an aircraft that responded before he finished the thought. The desert gave him none of those things. A B-502 had come off the line at Castle Bromwich in late 1942. Standard tropical fit, Vokes filter, 4-blade propeller, 220mm Hispano cannon, 4.303 Brownings, armour plate behind the seat. It had been a good fighter once, but 3 months of operations had worn it down. The filter housing was cracked from rough landings. The intake ducts were clogged despite daily cleaning. The control surfaces had slackened in the heat. Paint had blistered across the upper wings. Harlow had watched the aircraft deteriorate. He had signed off on patch repairs, cleaned intakes, adjusted linkages, kept it flying, but now the engineering officer wanted it grounded for a depot-level overhaul. Factory parts, proper documentation, 3 weeks minimum, but 3 weeks was unacceptable. The problem was not just one aircraft, it was doctrine. Every Spitfire in theatre fought the same battle. Power loss from filters, dust ingestion, short runways, surprise engagements at low altitude where climb rate and acceleration mattered more than ceiling. The factory had built these fighters for the Channel, for high cover over bombers, for combat at 20,000 feet where the air was thin and clean. North Africa demanded something different, and number 103MU had been modifying aircraft for months to meet that demand. Streamlined intake fairings fabricated from salvaged panels, clipped wings for faster roll response, polished leading edges to reduce skin friction, carburetor adjustments for better throttle response in the heat, gun harmonization set for close-range convergence. It was not official, it was not in the manuals, but it worked. Harlow studied the work card again. Then he looked at AB502. He saw an airframe that could be rebuilt, not restored, rebuilt, purpose-made for the fight Gleed was flying. He called his tinsmith over, pointed at the cracked filter housing. "We're not waiting for factory parts," he said. "We're building new ones." The ace needed agility at treetop height, and the desert was stealing power. The Vokes filter was a compromise, a necessary evil, a piece of engineering designed to save engines at the cost of everything else. It sat beneath the Merlin like a tumour, a bulbous drum 18 inches across, wrapped in perforated metal, packed with oiled wire mesh. Air entered through slots along the sides, passed through the mesh, and fed into the supercharger intake. The mesh caught sand. It also caught speed. Drag increased by 8%. Maximum speed dropped by 12 miles per hour. Climb rate fell by 400 feet per minute. At low altitude, where every knot mattered, those numbers were the difference between closing on a target and watching it slip away. Harlow had run the calculations in his head a dozen times. He had watched pilots push throttles forward and get nothing back. He had listened to Gleed describe engagements where the enemy turned inside him, climbed away from him, disappeared into haze before he could bring guns to bear. The filter was not the only problem, it was just the most visible one. Dust worked its way past seals and gaskets no matter how carefully they were fitted. It scored cylinder walls, clogged oil lines, fouled spark plugs. Engines ran rough after 50 hours. Magnetos misfired. Carburetors hesitated on throttle transitions. Power delivery became unpredictable. And unpredictability killed pilots. Then there was heat. Ambient temperatures at Aboukir climbed past 110 degrees Fahrenheit by midday. The Merlin, designed for temperate climates, ran hot. Coolant temperatures spiked, oil thinned, tolerances shifted, bolts loosened, gaskets wept. Everything that could expand did expand. The airfield itself added to the burden. Aboukir's strip was compacted sand, rough and rutted. Landings were hard. Takeoffs shook rivets loose. Undercarriages took punishment. Tailwheels collapsed. Propeller tips picked up stones and came back chipped. More dust, and more drag, and less time. Every sortie was a race against entropy. Pilots flew hard. Mechanics worked harder. But the margin for error kept shrinking. Gleed's missions were the worst kind for an airframe. Low-level sweeps, deck-height interceptions, ground attack runs where the aircraft spent minutes at full throttle, skimming dunes and scrub, pulling sharp brakes to avoid flak. The Spitfire was not built for that kind of flying. It was built for grace, for elegance, for the thin cold air of high altitude. The desert demanded brutality. Harlow had seen what happened when performance slipped. He had watched pilots return from patrols shaking their heads. He had read combat reports that ended with phrases like unable to close and lost contact. He had stood beside wreckage brought in from forward strips, trying to piece together what had failed and why. Sometimes it was mechanical, sometimes it was tactical, but often it was both. An aircraft just slightly slower, just slightly less responsive, just slightly more reluctant to climb or turn, and that slight difference was enough. The engineering officer did not see it that way. He saw regulations, maintenance schedules, approved parts, documented procedures. He saw an aircraft that needed depot-level overhaul, not field expedients. Harlow respected that view. He understood it, but he did not agree with it. The war was not being fought in depots. It was being fought over coastal roads and rail junctions and forward landing grounds where the enemy appeared without warning and vanished just as fast. Pilots needed aircraft that could respond. Now. Not 3 weeks from now. Gleed was one of the best pilots in the wing. He understood his aircraft. He knew its limits. He flew to those limits and sometimes beyond them. But he could not fly faster than the Merlin would pull. He could not roll quicker than the ailerons would bite. He could not climb steeper than the air would allow. If performance would not come from the factory, it would have to come from the bench. Harlow walked the length of AB 502, running his hand along the fuselage skin. He stopped at the port wing root, studied the clipped wingtip, the aileron hinges, the fabric covering stretched tight over ribs and spars. He thought about what could be done, what should be done, what the aircraft needed to survive the next 50 sorties. Then he walked back to the workshop and pulled a salvage crate from beneath the workbench. Inside were panels cut from a crashed Spitfire, sheet aluminum, straight edges, clean metal. If performance would not come from the factory, it would come from a bench. Harlow sketched on the back of a requisition form. Not to scale, not to specification, just lines and circles showing what the intake could become. The Vokes filter was a drum, wide, blunt, honest about what it did and careless about the cost. His design was a wedge, a streamlined fairing that would smooth the airflow beneath the nose while still filtering out sand. Shallower profile, tighter integration with the cowling, less frontal area. The concept was not new. Other units had tried it. Some fitments worked, some did not. The difference was in the detail, in the sealing, in the internal baffling that kept dust away from the supercharger intake without choking the engine. He called it an Aboukir filter, not because he invented it, but because his section had refined it. Trial and error across a dozen rebuilds. Adjustments based on what failed and what held. A design that could be fabricated in the field with hand tools and salvaged aluminum. The tinsmith, Corporal Davies, leaned over his shoulder and studied the sketch. "How much do we take off the drag?" Davies asked. 4, maybe 5%, Harlow said, enough to get back 6 or 7 knots. And the dust? Wire mesh stays. Baffles stay. Oil treatment stays. We're not gambling with the engine. Davies nodded. He had built 3 of these fairings already. He knew the process. He also knew the risk. If the filter failed, if sand reached the supercharger, the engine would seize at full throttle. No warning, no time to glide home. But the risk of doing nothing was greater. Harlow moved to the second part of the plan, the wings. A B502 already had clipped tips. Standard modification for low-level fighters. 18 inches cut from each wingtip to reduce span and increase roll rate. But the ailerons were still rigged for high-altitude work. Sluggish. Too much resistance in the control circuit. Gleed had complained about it twice. Harlow wanted to re-rig the ailerons for lighter breakout force. Tighten the cables. Adjust the hinge fittings. Reduce friction in the pulleys. The change would make the controls more sensitive, easier to overstress if a pilot was rough, but Gleed was not rough, he was precise. Then there was the skin. A B502's camouflage paint had blistered and cracked under the sun. Bare aluminum showed through in patches. The transition from paint to metal created tiny steps in the airflow. Turbulence. Drag. Harlow wanted to strip the paint, fill the imperfections, and polish the leading edges. Not for appearance, for laminar flow. Smoother air meant less resistance. Less resistance meant more speed. It was the kind of work that took time. Days, not hours. But the aircraft was already grounded, and the engineering officer had given him 3 weeks. Harlow would need 4 days. He gathered the section, laid out the plan, showed them the sketch, explained what needed to happen and in what order. First, remove the Vaux filter and cut away the cracked housing. Fabricate a new fairing from salvaged panels. Fit the internal baffles. Seal the joints. Test for leaks. Second, re-rig the ailerons. Adjust cable tension. Lubricate pulleys. Check hinge play. Ensure symmetry between port and starboard circuits. Third, strip the forward fuselage and wing leading edges. Apply filler to rivet lines and panel joints. Sand smooth. Polish with solvent and cloth until the aluminum gleamed. Fourth, retune the engine. Check ignition timing. Adjust carburetor float levels for hot start reliability. Clean fuel filters. Verify boost pressure across the rev range. Fifth, reharmonize the guns. Gleed preferred tight convergence. 200 yards. All weapons focused on a single point. Maximum destructive effect at close range. The work was methodical, sequential. Each task built on the one before. No shortcuts, no assumptions. Davies looked at the sketch again. What if the engineering officer finds out before we're done? He will, Harlow said, but he'll find out after the first ground run. After we prove it works. Not factory, fit for purpose. The section broke for tea. Then they hauled AB502 into the work bay and positioned it beneath the canvas shelter. The sun was already high. The temperature was climbing, but the shade would hold for a few hours. Harlow opened his tool roll, selected a pair of tin snips, walked to the nose of the aircraft. He placed one hand on the cracked Vaux housing, felt the metal warm beneath his palm. Then he cut the first restraining wire. By dawn, the Spitfire wore a new nose and shorter wings. They started with the intake. Davies marked the cut lines on the old Vaux housing with a scribe. Harlow held the assembly steady while the tinsmith worked the snips through the aluminum. The metal parted with a dull rasp. 4 cuts. Then the housing lifted away, exposing the supercharger inlet and the maze of ducts behind it. Dust had caked inside the throat, a fine grey powder that smelled of oil and heat. One of the riggers wiped it out with a cloth soaked in solvent. The sting of the fluid hung in the air. Davies laid the salvaged panels flat on the workbench. He had already traced the template onto the metal the night before. Now he cut the shapes. Long curved sections for the outer fairing, smaller pieces for the internal baffles, each cut deliberate, each edge deburred with a file to prevent cracking. The fairing took shape over 3 hours. Davies bent the panels around a wooden form, checking the curve against the fuselage line. The metal had to flow smoothly from the cowling to the intake without creating a step or a gap. Any disruption in the surface would trip the airflow and cost speed. He drilled rivet holes along the edges. Harlow positioned the fairing against the airframe and marked the mounting points. They worked in silence, passing tools without speaking. A rhythm built from years of shared work. The rivets went in cold. A pneumatic hammer drove them home with sharp metallic cracks. The bucking bar on the inside absorbed the impact, spreading the load across the backplate. Davies checked each rivet for tightness. No movement, no play. The baffles went in next. Wire mesh stretched across internal frames, oiled to catch dust. The mesh had to be dense enough to filter sand, but open enough to let air pass freely. Too much restriction and the engine would starve. Too little, and the supercharger would ingest grit. Harlow sealed the joints with paste, a thick grey compound that dried hard and airtight. He smoothed it with his thumb, working it into the seams. No leaks, no bypasses. The fairing sat low and sleek beneath the nose, a clean wedge that blended into the cowling line. Not beautiful, but purposeful. While Davies finished the intake, the riggers moved to the wings. They loosened the aileron control rods and disconnected the cables at the wing root. Each cable ran through a series of pulleys and bell cranks, transferring stick movement to control surface deflection. The system was simple in concept, but sensitive to friction. They cleaned each pulley bearing with solvent, flushed out old grease, packed fresh lubricant into the races, checked for wear on the cable guides. One pulley showed scoring on its rim. They replaced it with a spare from the store's rack. Cable tension came next. Too loose and the controls would feel sloppy. Too tight and they would bind. The rigger used a spring scale to measure the tension, pulling until the needle reached the specified value. Then he locked the turnbuckle and safetied the threads with wire. The ailerons moved smoothly now. Lighter breakout force, crisper response. Harlow pushed the stick in the cockpit and watched the port aileron rise. Sharp, immediate. He nodded. The armourer worked forward of the wings, adjusting the gun mounts. Each weapon had to be aligned to converge at 200 yards. He used a bore sighting jig, a wooden frame with crosshairs painted on canvas stretched at the far end of the hangar. Adjust check. Adjust again. The .303 Brownings were easier. Light recoil, predictable trajectory. The 20mm Hispanos required more care. Heavier rounds. Slower muzzle velocity. The armourer shimmed the cannon mounts until the crosshairs aligned. Harlow moved to the forward fuselage. The paint was already stripped, revealing bare aluminum beneath. He mixed filler paste and applied it to the rivet lines with a spatula. Thin layers. Each one sanded smooth after it cured. The work was slow, tedious, but necessary. He used progressively finer abrasive paper, coarse to knock down the high spots, medium to blend the transitions, fine to polish the surface. By the time he finished, the leading edges gleamed. No steps, no ridges, just smooth metal that caught the light. The engine work came last. Harlow pulled the cowling panels and inspected the Merlin. He checked the magneto timing with a brass gauge, adjusted the carburetor needle valves, cleaned the fuel filters, verified the oil pressure relief valve setting. They cut, they shaped, and they sealed. On the fourth morning, Harlow primed the engine and hit the starter. The Merlin coughed, caught, settled into a rough idle that smoothed as it warmed. He ran it up to full power, watched the boost gauge, listened to the exhaust note. Boost pressure steady, temperatures good, no misfires. He throttled back and let it cool. A B-502 was ready. Gleed arrived at first light. He walked the perimeter of the aircraft slowly, one hand trailing along the fuselage. He stopped at the nose, studied the new fairing, ran his fingers across the seam where it met the cowling. "What am I looking at?" he asked. "Streamlined intake," Harlow said. "Aboukir pattern. 4% less drag than the Vokes. Same filtration." Gleed crouched beside the filter, looked at the welds, the baffles visible through the intake slots. "You built this here?" "We did." The wing commander stood, moved to the wing root, checked the aileron hinge line, pushed the trailing edge with his hand. It moved easily, crisply. "Control rigging?" Lighter breakout force, tighter cables. You wanted roll rate. Gleed nodded. He walked to the cockpit and pulled himself onto the wing, settled into the seat, reached for the stick and moved it through its full range of travel. Port, starboard, forward, after. His expression did not change. He climbed down, looked at Harlow. Did you log this work? Every item on the aircraft card. Did you get engineering approval? I did not. Gleed was silent for a moment. Then he pulled on his helmet and fastened the chin strap. Let's see if it flies. The ground crew pulled the chocks. Gleed taxied to the end of the strip, turned into the wind, and ran through his checks. Temperatures, pressures, controls, magnetos, trim. He advanced the throttle. The Merlin climbed to full power. The Spitfire rolled forward, tail lifting, accelerating down the compacted sand. Rotation, climb, wheels retracting. Harlow watched from beside the work bay. The engine note was clean. No roughness, no hesitation. Gleed levelled at 500 feet and made a pass down the runway. Low. Fast. The Spitfire's shadow raced across the sand beneath him. He pulled up into a climbing turn, rolled inverted at the top, rolled upright again. The aircraft responded without lag, without slop. He flew for 20 minutes, steep turns, accelerations, slow flight followed by full throttle dives, testing every corner of the envelope, feeling what had changed. When he landed, he taxied back to the work bay and shut down. He sat in the cockpit for a moment after the propeller stopped turning. Then he climbed out. Throttle response is sharper, he said. Roll rate is noticeably better. Feels lighter on the controls. Any vibration? Any roughness? None. Engine is smooth across the range. Harlow made notes on the work card. Gleed watched him write. How much faster? The Wing Commander asked. 6 knots, maybe 7. We won't know until you run it against a measured course. Gleed nodded. I'll take it on the next patrol. Low-level sweep along the coast. If there's a problem, I'll know quickly. If there's a problem, come back. I will. The patrol launched 3 hours later. 4 aircraft, Gleed leading. They flew east along the shoreline at 200 feet, hunting for road convoys and rail traffic. The formation stayed tight. Gleed's Spitfire held position without drift. 30 miles out, they spotted a truck column moving south on the coast road. Gleed called the attack. The formation split. 2 aircraft per pass. Guns converging at close range. Gleed dove first. The Spitfire accelerated cleanly. No shudder, no buffet. He opened fire at 300 yards, walked the rounds forward. Cannon shells struck the lead truck. It slewed off the road and stopped. He pulled up hard. The controls bit immediately. No lag. The Spitfire rolled into a climbing turn that brought him back around for a second pass. He fired again. Short burst. Another truck stopped. The other aircraft followed him through. Then the formation turned west and climbed back to altitude. They landed 50 minutes after takeoff. Gleed taxied to the revetment and shut down. He pulled off his helmet and sat for a moment in the cockpit, hands resting on the coaming. Harlow walked to the wing. How was it? Alive, Gleed said. He climbed down, walked once around the aircraft, stopped at the intake fairing, placed his hand on the warm metal. Whatever you did, do it to the rest of the wing. He signed the work card, handed it back to Harlow. Then he walked toward the operations tent without looking back. No fanfare, just a nod from the ace. And another job card closed. The modifications did not stop with AB 502. Over the following weeks, Harlow's section rebuilt 6 more Spitfires using the same approach. Streamlined intakes, re-rigged controls, polished leading edges, each aircraft tailored to the mission profile it would fly. Number. 103 Maintenance Unit had been doing this work since early 1942. It was not innovation, it was adaptation, the kind that happened when distance from supply lines forced creativity and operational tempo demanded results. The Aboukir filter became standard practice at the unit. Ground crews fabricated them from salvaged panels and fitted them to any aircraft that came through for rebuild. The design was never formalized, never issued as a technical order. It simply spread through the maintenance network because it worked. Other modifications followed the same pattern. Clipped wings for low-level agility, extended wings for high-altitude interception, engine tuning for hot weather reliability. Some teams at Aboukir even built specialized Spitfires to chase Ju-86P reconnaissance aircraft at extreme altitude, stripping weight and optimizing supercharger performance for operations above 40,000 feet. None of this appeared in official records. No engineering reports, no approval chains. Just work cards signed by section leaders and pilots who flew the results. The Desert War rewarded this kind of flexibility. Doctrine written in England did not account for sand, heat, and rough forward strips. Factory specifications assumed controlled conditions and predictable wear patterns, but the theatre imposed its own requirements, and the maintenance units met them. Harlow's work was not unique, it was representative. Across North Africa, ground crews solved problems that headquarters never saw. They rebuilt engines with improvised tools, fabricated parts that supply chains could not deliver, modified airframes to meet threats that training manuals did not cover. They were mechanics, fitters, riggers, men whose names did not appear in combat reports, whose contributions were measured in serviceability rates and sortie counts rather than medals or mentions. But they were force multipliers. Every aircraft they returned to operations was one more fighter in the line. Every hour they saved was one more patrol flown. Every modification they made was a small edge that accumulated across hundreds of sorties into something larger. Wing Commander Gleed flew AB-502 through the remainder of the North African campaign. The aircraft performed without fault. When the wing moved to Malta and then to Italy, the Spitfire went with him. It survived the war. So did Gleed, though he was killed in a flying accident in 1945, months after the fighting ended. The Aboukir modifications faded from use as supply lines shortened and factory support improved. By 1944, purpose-built variants of the Spitfire were available for every role. Low-level fighters came with clipped wings as standard. Tropical filters were refined and streamlined at the factory. The need for field expedients diminished, but the principle remained. Theatre-level problems solved by maintenance initiative, not memos, not committees, just quiet competence applied to immediate needs. Harlow returned to England in late 1944. He was promoted to warrant officer, served out the war training ground crews. He never spoke much about the work at Aboukir. When asked, he would shrug and say it was simply what needed doing. That was the truth of it. No grand vision, no revolutionary insight. Just a mechanic who saw a problem, understood the tools at his disposal, and built a solution that worked. The lesson is not in the modification itself. Streamlined intakes and polished skins were small gains, incremental improvements that added up to a few knots and a slightly tighter turn radius. The lesson is in the willingness to act, to see the gap between what doctrine prescribed and what the mission demanded, to trust experience over procedure when the situation warranted it, to build what was needed rather than wait for what was authorized. Not standard, not pretty, but faster. The sheet metal cools under the desert stars. The wind shifts, carrying sand across the taxiway. A B-502 sits on its chocks, cowlings fastened, fuel tanks topped, guns loaded. At dawn, The Merlin will fire. The propeller will bite air. The Spitfire will roll toward the strip, light and purposeful, ready for whatever the morning brings. The sheet metal cools. The desert wind returns. The Spitfire rolls out, lighter, meaner, and ready.